Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the Youth Pastors Podcast. My name is John, and I get to co-host alongside the Garret Thor Balcetis. And this is our second episode of this format of our podcast. We've got a pilot episode that talks about some of our origin story. Anytime we're in person, probably capture something more intimate and related to our relationship because it goes all the way back to when I was 16. I'm 32 now, and Garrett's freaking 40. But that's because he was my youth pastor, my first boss in ministry. And so if you're listening along, you're probably somebody that's in youth and next gen ministry. And today we're going to answer the question, why does youth ministry suck?
Plain and simple, baby.
Really?
No, man, it is. And that's the conversation you and I were having, off air, right? It's just the ongoing conversation throughout the years, throughout the last few decades. Does it feel like youth ministry isn't working when we look at stats? And, I think that's an important conversation to have. And it's tough because if you're not careful, you'll beat yourself up over it and you try to figure it out. But really, it's the evolution feeling. Are there the same amount of people that either walk away from their faith or the same amount of people that keep their faith? And it seems like the amount of people that walk away from their faith is really only growing. And it makes you question, what are we doing?
Yeah, well, I know you got some statistics. I just know for me, ever since I've been in youth ministry, like starting when I was 18, there was this sense that, hey, kids are walking away from God. Most of them, in fact. I remember at one point, it was like a stat I heard was 75%, like 3 in 4 kids that were in a youth ministry are walking away. I was at an event with Fuller Youth Institute in Dallas earlier this year where they were talking about they project it's something like 46 million kids who are currently in youth group to walk away from God in the next 10 years based off of current trends and statistics. But I know that you did some research and some of these won't be new to you guys, but I think as we're starting this, let's lay the battlefield, the playing field, like really what we're looking at when it comes to, and is youth ministry working? Is church working for young people?
Yeah, so I'll go through and just read some of these basically, and you can pause them whenever. There's not too many of them, but I just went ahead and compared the stats from the year 2000, 2010, and 2024, mainly because there's a bunch of stats that just dropped in the last 2 months. So most of them, the 2024 is within the last year, 23, 24. But in 2000, around 12% of Americans, adults, held a biblical worldview. All right, so there was a relatively higher retention rate of faith among young people compared to later years. A significant number of people, including youth, believed in absolute moral truths to traditional Christian values. In 2010, the amount of adults dropped to about 9%. So from 12% to 9%. And one of the biggest youth trends of 2010 was distancing from traditional Christian beliefs became more noticeable. The influence of secular culture and alternative worldviews started gaining traction among young people. Also, the term moral relativism becomes kind of in the picture here, where there's increasing acceptance of moral relativism, where more choices were seen as subjective and based on individual preferences rather than biblical standards. It's interesting because 2010, that era, you begin to see really the large span of the iPhone, of social media, of access to everything worldwide, right? It's instant. So fast forward to 2024, only 4% of American adults now hold a biblical worldview. Among preteens, only 1%, it's actually less than that. I think it's 0.4% possesses a biblical worldview. The trend shows that children grow into their teen years, the likelihood of maintaining their faith diminishes further. So if they are encountering Christ for the first time in their teens, it's actually a less percentage chance they're going to live it out. And today's youth are significantly more likely to reject core Christian beliefs. For instance, only 21% of the 8 to 12-year-olds believe in absolute moral truth, and only 36% of young teens, 13 to 14 years old, believe in existence of an all-knowing, all-powerful God. The dominant worldview among American adults, including youth, is syncretism, which is a word you and I have been talking about. And it's a blend of various...
but you've been telling me about
Well, I'll tell you the definition. It's a blend. It's a blend of various philosophies, a blend of beliefs tailored to an individual preference, so which often conflict with biblical teaching. So yes, I believe in God. Yes, I believe in the Bible, but I also believe X, Y, Z, right? So things that don't necessarily line up with what you're saying, with what you say you believe. So when your beliefs kind of are on both sides of the spectrum, they're not in sync. That's how that word that's like the root word there, right? Syncretism. So when your own values don't line up with your beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, I think we got to call this episode The Problem with Youth Ministry, because it's the problem with youth ministry but it's also the problem we're trying to solve. And as you were talking, it reminded me of a conversation I was in when I was just on staff. My first 10 years of vocational ministry, Garret and I were at the same church. And I think I would just been put on staff after 4 years of being an intern and support staff. And I was in one of my first director meetings, or something. And it was about the internship, because at the time we all had interns, all of our departments. And we were talking about some problem and with the internship and recruitment and something like that. And I remember asking a question, I was 21, right? Or 22, something like that, young. And I just remember asking at the boardroom, is one of my, the boardroom that became a printer room. Remember that room? Like that, or the printer room that became a board. I can't remember. And then it went back. I think it actually went back several times. I don't know. But oh my gosh, Garret, I just found out that this crew neck that I ordered has pockets like a hoodie. I just discovered that in this moment. This is such a good day. No, but this is awesome.
Also, is it normal for every mega church to build 15 boardrooms every couple of years? They just build a new, it's just what happened.
I did a meme that said it was like someone looking like this, and it was like, when you didn't get a raise this year, but the church built 3 new green rooms. You're like, feels bad. But I remember raising my hand, Garret. All this is making sense. I remember raising my hand and I said, hey, are we reaching out to past interns, and are we keeping track of where people who have gone through this program are ending up? I just thought, I'm like, well, we should ask them. And that makes sense, right? The success of our program is determined by the outcome and where they go. You would have thought I swore or hit someone, and they looked at me and I'll never forget, the person leading the meeting looked at me and said, it is not our job to follow up with what they do after they leave this program. And I just think that is a fundamental problem, I think, with a lot of American ministry is, also remember, history lesson, depending on your age. Remember when the Samsung Galaxy came out with a phone that set on fire, literally set on fire? How quickly did the world act on that, right? This I've designed in California, assembled in China, and it has for years, worked. And that is why this is one of the most valuable, if not the most valuable product that is in the world, because it works. And Apple doesn't just measure the design or the marketing, but it measures the outcome and the user experience. I think the problem with youth ministry is that we literally stop caring about students stop measuring once they leave the ministry that, we don't measure it. Even all the stats you're saying, Garret, could be summed up in one stat of saying how many youth ministries have active data, records, and measure where their students are post-graduation. Why do no youth ministries have graduating classes with names linked to where those students are now, what church they're a part of, what they did? Why don't we? I don't know that I know the answer. It's just, why don't we? And how can we expect to have a good product if we don't care about, it's like we have phones on fire in people's pockets, but we don't care.
Yeah, I think that's an ongoing conversation I try to have with a lot of youth pastors regarding a certain topic, which we always just called bridge systems, right? So to make an excellent middle school ministry, in my opinion, you need an awesome bridge system from 4th, 5th grade, from the kids ministry on up to middle school. And then the awesome handoff from 8th grade to high school the same way, right? An awesome bridge ministry from middle school into high school. And then either, yes, into the young adults, but also what is the care process for when these kids go off to school? And that's part of the journey is when we just hand off roles to, let's say, a life group leader. Well, ideally, yeah, it'd be nice if this life group leader had a lifelong relationship with this person. That's not what everyone signs up for. I get that. So what's the system that you're putting in place as a ministry? But I think, John, I have to pause right there, because when you look at the turnover rate of average youth pastors and how long they're a youth pastor, what lifelong system do you expect to be in place at a church when the turnover rate is faster than the graduation rate of the product itself? So I think you end up with a kind of a broken culture in just the capital C church already when that's the mentality. Do students have a place to come home to when they're home for holidays and summer after they've graduated? Yeah. There's all these weird touch points that could be taking place and happening. And is that on the youth ministry? Is that on the church itself? And I think very few churches have a killer young adult ministry. Some have a young adult ministry. Some just do a life group based. But I mean, Where's this, is it the pastoral team that's taking, where's that bridge system? And I know it's not really what we're talking about, but that's just a huge key piece that I think is missing all the time in order to make that success rate huge.
No, I mean, I think this is interesting, that even if in this podcast we just raise questions and pose problems, because for this episode at least, because we do a lot of things, like, and if you aren't aware, like at the Youth Pastors, we help churches hands-on build their next gen, their youth ministries strategically. We don't do like courses. We don't really even do coaching. We do strategy and people development, and we work in tangent, hand in hand with churches. So we do offer solutions all the time. Problem is though, Garrett, is like what you're bringing up is that a lot of times people are trying to add new sails on a ship that has holes in the bottom. And I think some of what you're talking about, some of these systemic issues of like, why don't we measure seniors? Why isn't that part of someone's job performance or just the heart of the church? Why are we transitioning youth pastors? Why can't we keep youth pastors? Why don't churches have a network? Like, it's so weird, and that maybe goes to some of the weird competitive nature of churches, where shouldn't churches, how come there isn't a thing that exists that all churches know, hey, I'm sending this many seniors to your city? Wouldn't churches want to receive that? I don't know.
And also there's there's so many directions I could take this, but I do always find it interesting because it's not really based on an age, it's a season of life, right? When you go from being a young adult to a young professional. And so a young adult can be from 18 to 25, but you could also become a young professional at 22 or whatever. Like when you're just ready for that next season of adult life, a lot of people take a lot longer to get there, and that's okay. The hard part is the young adult era, no matter how long it lasts, is not the Sunday morning target for most senior leaders. And if it's not the target, when are you hoping to capture that person? After they have a good income, after they're tithers, after they're married and have 1.2 kids? What is that target? And most likely the target is not the young adult. We don't fund a young adult ministry. So we just hope they gather someplace, but there's no, you know what I'm saying? It's just like this lost era. And then we hope these people hold on to their values, to their beliefs, to their experiences, and come rushing back into our building when they have a great job and a family. And it's like, unless they're great labor. If they're great labor, plug them in somewhere, that's awesome. But it's one of those things like, how do we utilize them?
If we can get them to pay us to go to our college.
I see it in every state.
With no promise of, dude, one of my first big youth pastor memes is I did a 2024 youth pastor starter kit, and it was like Nike Blazers, I don't know, something, and then Southeastern satellite site, which...
Dude, I'm out here by Grand Canyon University, which I did not realize is like the largest online college. They just have always crushed it with that. They were so ahead of the game. But the church Rachel and I are at, there are so many GCU kids, and dude, they are sharp. They are like, they're awesome. And they're running the VBS. They're doing all the things. Their young adults are like, just the population of young adults is crazy and huge. So it has revitalized this thought process in my head all the time about how are you setting these people up to win? And I think what you said is so great. When you're sending a kid off to college as a youth pastor, are you resourcing them? Are you helping them get plugged in? Are you helping them find a local church where they are going, the city they're moving to? Or are we just like doing the barbecue, see you later, it's been a fun 7 years, thanks for being a part of the ministry,
Well, I mean, but even send off, or the lack of send off, or the lack of thing, speaks to what you're bringing up, which is, well, why don't we? Well, because the moment they graduate as a senior, they stop counting. Like, I was never graded as a youth pastor. I was graded by how many kids I had in my program that between 6th and 12th grade. And the moment they stop being a 12th grader, honestly, they start becoming a liability. They start becoming added work. And then we try to cram a few of them, like you said, to be laborers or like to become youth leaders. But the rest were like, yeah, good luck, dude. And
okay, let's talk about just that for a brief second here. That is a tension point. I think a lot of maybe youth pastors that don't have a high, like extremely high capacity, don't know how to navigate, because it becomes a tension point, right? Because, hey, you're graduated high school and it's easy for me to continue to take care of you if you're jumping in as a leader and you can become part of my system. The hard part is the kids that aren't going to come serve. They're not going to come be a leader. They still need you to be their youth pastor, but they're 18, 19 years old.
Yeah.
And the youth pastor is either going to figure out how to distance themselves, or they're going to figure out a care strategy for that individual. It's basically one of those two things. So,
and we know, like, we're speaking from experience too, guys. So listening to this, a lot of why we're talking about some of the systemic issues is because we know that some of it feels outside of your control. And I think I've said this all the time, One Hope and, and then with Feed and then Fuller Youth. And I keep getting put in all these cohorts. And I'm like, I don't know why y'all are talking to us youth pastors. We're the ones that, like, one, youth pastors can't make huge decisions. We don't have control over our budget. We can't make hires. So I've told all these big $1 million Christian, I don't mean $1 million in a bad way. I just mean, like, they have genuine resource and, like, they've stewarded that. And, like, big ministries are like, how do we change and how do we stop it? I go, stop talking to us. Go talk to the senior pastors. Y'all go, like, we go to get the executive pastors. We can't change any of this. Like, I can't approve. I don't know what to tell you. There's got to be more of a fundamental shift in how we value and resource next gen ministry that I think is honestly can feel a lot bigger than what the youth pastor has control over.
Yeah, I think it's huge, but also, man, I think depending on the age of the youth pastor, I have met way too many youth pastors in the past few years that don't ever get face-to-face time with their senior leader. They have a direct report. It's not their senior pastor. And they don't know how to have those constructive conversations up the chain. You know what I mean? Like they can maybe list some things out or talk about things that are difficult, but they don't know how to make the hard asks upward.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to not just look at this thing and be like, hey, senior pastors, you got to do better.
Well, I mean, I think they do, but I think the numbers would just tell us that. But I don't think that, we talked about this in our pilot episode. I think leadership is taking responsibility all the way around. And so it's like, you have to control what you can control. And there's absolutely nothing worse than someone being a victim. And so at the end of the day, you need to do what Garret is saying and try to enact change up. But then outside of that, you need to do everything that you can within your control to live a healthy life honoring God and then win within your ministry. And the reason why I say live a healthy life honoring God is because sometimes I've been in situations where I try to compensate for my church's lack of investment in youth ministry by overcompensating my role. And like what I go, well, if you guys aren't going to care, then I'm just going to work 70 hours a week. And yeah, there's a couple years I could do that, but it gets old real quick. And it's honestly not even that effective in the long term. You just spin your tires. And if I was the devil, if there was a real Satan, if there's real spiritual warfare, if there's real anything like that, I would just get into some people's heads and say, just work harder. It's not just about working harder. I think it's about figuring out how to assess where you are and do something about it. Let's get back to, I like that analogy of the boat. There some of the holes in the boat are outside of your control, but they're still your responsibility to try to change. There's a church that I've done some work with in Knoxville, Long Hollow. Shout out Alec. Dude, they have a guy, gosh, I can't remember his name. I believe it's Ben. He's the parent pastor. I just love that, and you know why parent ministry is thriving at Long Hollow? Because they staffed it. They made it a priority. But just because that doesn't exist at your church doesn't mean that it can't. Put together a pitch, advocate for it, push for it, make it happen.
Yeah, and I feel like I feel like at a well-established church, I feel like it's pretty common for the kids ministry to have a good idea of trying to create parent resources. But again, if you don't have good communication between your youth and kids department, you don't have a good bridge system, it just ends in the kids ministry. I don't get why we're not creating those things. Like the parent influence, like it's actually part of even like the stats things, right? It's like that I pulled up is like many parents say they lack a biblical worldview, knowing that we read that. And so it often delegates the spiritual development to somebody else, to ideally somebody like a youth pastor. But you're talking what? If your kid goes to youth group for an hour every week, the entire year, it's 52 hours a year.
Dang.
That's it. And I don't know any ministry needs 52 weeks a year, or at least they shouldn't. It's one of those things where what's the parent plan? parents, as just like a generational thing, it's tough because a lot of parents these days, like they delegate a lot of things. A lot of times they delegate to a device, to an iPad, to this, to that, to a TV. And you're going, they're not equipped themselves anymore to handle the development because they haven't resourced themselves. They clearly are most likely, according statistically, not handling their own faith and understanding of faith. So of course they can't develop it into their children.
Well, and that's where I think, again, leaky ship. We're trying to add, and this is where I think I see the attention I see is, how do we do gaming ministry? How do we do more social media? How do we program bigger events? How do we look like that church? How do we do? And they're trying to fix the sales. They're trying to, but I'm like, bro, you're leaking at the bottom. It doesn't matter like how cool the conference is if you don't have parent ministry figured out. It doesn't matter how good the design is. It's just interesting. And I think that's human nature. We're all guilty of it, is focusing on what feels fun to improve than what would be difficult to actually fix. And I think that parents is another area that is just parents and young adults, the transitions. These are bleeding areas of a lot of our youth ministries. And I think that the problem with some of the social media and the big events is it's not just that we're building things out of order, putting the cart before the horse, in a sequential sense, right? Because that's bad. Like doing things out of sequence just in and of itself is just not wise, but it's also just taking time and energy, it's all these churches, they want to have conferences and they want to be cool and they want to have merch. It's like, dude, if you don't have a foundation, who cares how cool we are, and it's so much of youth ministry pressure. And I feel for you guys is, how do we get to 100? How do we get to 150? How do we get to 200 in a year, in 6 months time? And it's just like, why is that a thing? Like, why is the quantity pressure so much more than the quality pressure?
It is. It really produces a hollow culture, right? So when you're there, when you're plugged in and you're in it, and again, maybe if you're just the leader of it, you're not tuned in enough to realize it. But if you step back and ingrain yourself, what you've measured or created or designed or painted the target as the win, if it's just dollar signs or numbers, like there's certain, I think, aspects of that you have to realize, if we're more about the culture war, what are the cultures we want to see being developed? If those were the wins that you're painting, I think it changes a lot of what you experience. Yeah, you can still sell merch. Yeah, you can still paint targets for numbers and do all those things. But what culture are you building intentionally in this process, right? I think too, John, there's been just in the last decade, last 10 to 14 years, right? The growth and exposure of a media-driven generation that has never known anything other than the access to on-demand stimuli and entertainment has got to have a strong effect on what it means to intake the right thing.
I just asked AI to make us our wooden ship. Actually looks pretty cool. We'll put it as like the thumbnail or something, maybe. The problem with youth ministry. It is pretty good.
This is a sick ship.
Yeah, dude, them holes are gaping. Yeah, I mean, I definitely think social media. I mean, yeah, let's just drill down. I mean, in the last few minutes here of this, it's probably a two-parter.
Yeah.
Maybe the other gaping hole is like media comparison to other churches. I mean, dude, I started youth. I guess I really started in like a intern staff role, 2010, right as freaking Carl Lentz at Hillsong, New York. And I mean, dude, just everything that was celebrated is the numbers, the crowds, the line, the vibe, the big, the boom, the bang, the got the bump, bump. And it just, and I'm like, and it's until I got Instagram, and juxtapose that to when we were in Florida, when I was a kid, we were a part of a church that was somewhere between 300 and 400 adults. And it would not be irregular for our youth ministry to have between 200 and 300 students. What crazy ratios. I don't think I ever heard the word growing up, revival. I never heard someone say, isn't it so cool what we're like? There was just no sense to me that like we were trying to tell anyone else, some other church media world. Like, I didn't even know until I can't remember what year it dawned on me where I go, wait, what the frick? Like, yeah, people talk about Asbury Revival. People talk, I'm like, call it what you want, but I'm like, I was a part of something that I don't think even I realized it was very special what we were a part of. It didn't make news, it didn't whatever, but I'm like, we were there. God was moving in a very unique way at a 400-person church that met in like a Ramada convention hall, that God was doing that much in hundreds of lives of teenagers. But it just never, but that was 2008, 2009. I graduated in 2010. iPhones and Instagram really didn't come onto the scene until 2010, 2011, 2012. And I think that definitely has something to do with it, like this pressure to get big fast.
Yeah, and I think when the experience is real and genuine, you don't have to create a hype reel to try to sell it. There's no snake oil attached to it. And yeah, I mean, I know that we've all probably lived enough youth ministry to like hate to go back to that way of thinking of when you're trying to explain to kids that you don't have to like just post your highlights, like the amount of times that we had to remind kids that on a stage, when in reality, it's dang, all that stuff has shaped a generation or two now as far as what we convey to the world. Whereas now, if you look, the way that people just live, they don't know how to date in person. They don't know how to have genuine conversations or relationships. But instead, all these kids still put a phone in front of them, turn on record, they hit, they do their live or whatever, and they just like, blah, onto the screen.
I saw a tweet. A guy said, it like went viral, and a guy said, can we just have an OnlyFans just for dudes, but not in a sex way, just so I can meet dudes to be friends with? I just have a really hard time making friends. But I mean, I feel like it summed up so much of how just like weird. I think in high school, kids do generally okay because you have orchestrated friendship, even in aspects of college, right? Man, you hit 25, you hit 26, you hit 27, you have a couple moves under you, you make a couple babies, and all of this, it just gets really disconnected, But I think that even thinking historically, if you named some of the big ministry heroes of the day, like one of the big ones would be Billy Graham, and the crowds in the packed arenas. He was an evangelist, but I feel like a lot of our modern churches are modeled after an evangelist instead of pastors and shepherds. And I think that's something that you've always taught, is like, you even made us read a book and taught us like the way of the shepherd, like our role. Like, I'm not saying that evangelism isn't a thing. It is a thing. It needs to be a thing. We both gotten to see Reggie Dabbs in freaking action. I mean, I don't know if they're, again, I would even say he's underrated. Like, dude, that man, we saw him literally out of his face and finish like a school assembly, like while blood was pouring out of his face. And he led kids to Jesus, like in a public school. But I think a lot of times, I don't think pastors know if they're an evangelist or a shepherd. And I think a lot of times we have the roles mismatched.
Yeah, and I think here's the Billy Graham lie, in my opinion. And not that Billy Graham was a lie. It's that we use Billy Graham now as the wrong idea. We think we want to build something like that. What we were never taught about the Billy Graham strategy is he would go to a city and partner with 10, 20, 30 different churches, so that when they got all the people to the rally, they had a home to plug into. Based upon the proximity of where they lived, there's an entire strategy. But us as churches of a certain size, or really any size, we don't like to share. We don't like to collaborate. We don't like to partner. We want the attention. We want the hype. We want like the highlight reel from it. Look what God's doing here. It's this whole thing. When in reality, can this not be about us or this thing or this building or this ministry? Can it just be about the people and the sheep that need to come home? What is best for them? What is that best strategy for them? And it's crazy to me because so many churches are built on the backs of an individual, and they prop up that individual on, and that's the selling point. If we can create this individual, it'll draw more attention. It's easier to sell a person, and that is such a dangerous game to play. Not saying any names this week, as there's a church in Texas looking for a new pastor that has 100,000 people attend every Sunday, right? Like, it's really easy to take out
20 churches in Texas. So I don't know what you mean.
Gateway church reference.
No, I know.
Oh, I wasn't supposed to bleep it out. Bleep out Robert Morris's name. Don't touch kids.
Dude.
Save that for another episode because I'll shred some people.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's shocking to me that much of Jesus' ministry was not about the crowds. I mean, the crowds were a part of it, but that wasn't the end goal. And I think I was even reading in Mark, dude. Maybe it's Mark 16. There's just a whole part where Jesus is like, what's John 6? And Jesus goes, it's after the feed the 5,000, Jesus walks on water. Jesus says, I'm the bread of life. All this good stuff happening. And then it's many disciples desert Jesus. On hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? Aware that his disciples were grumbling about this, Jesus said to them, does this offend you? Then what if you see the Son of Man ascend to where he was before? The Spirit gives life, the flesh counts for nothing. The words I've spoken to you, they are full of the Spirit and life. Yet there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus had known from the beginning which of them did not believe and who would betray him. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled them. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. And it's just, but what did he produce on the other side of his earthly ministry? 11 dudes that were solid. And then a core of other dudes that they would pull up from Matthias from that would end up in that 120 people in the upper room. And if you follow my content, you know, I've talked about this a lot, but I'm just like, that 12 turned into 120, and that 120 turned to 3,000. But that 3,000 the day of Pentecost was the fruit of 3 years of Jesus taking his time, not to build the quantity of ministries, but to build the quality of it. And I think that the problem with youth ministry is that just fall into the trap of caring too much about the crowd and not about the disciples, and too much about the quantity and not about the quality.
Well, yeah, man, I think too that if we're not careful, we end up on a leadership team or a church staff where if you're not careful, you wind up caring about the quality of programming instead of the quality of personnel.
And you say you care about discipleship. You say you care about personnel, but we can't we have to audit the actions, not the intentions.
Yeah, I also think just the journey of an individual, and dude, it's crazy to me. Like, I love that churches measure their whatever by baptisms, but baptisms are like the beginning of the journey. Where are these people 5 years later, 10 years later? Like,
dude, holy crap. I think you and I've talked about it before. I thought other people were going to do it. I think we got to do it. We got to make a new dashboard. People just always say, the reason why we measured salvations and baptisms is because you can't measure spiritual growth. It's called the fruit of the Spirit. There's other ways to measure it. Like, even like things like, one of the things I'm really grateful for that you provided me as a teenager was the opportunity to go on a missions trip. I think it's kind of a lost art in certain church circles. Our church giving me the opportunity to get outside of it. I mean, so even that, like a new dashboard, new metrics, like how many of your 300 kids, how many of your 40 kids serve on Sundays or serve the homeless, or I don't know. Yeah, you can't necessarily display the fruit of the Spirit, but and again, at some point, all metrics and dashboards break down, but I think it'd at least be a start to say, let's stop just measuring the beginning of the journey. Let's measure deeper aspects of it.
Or just make that the beginning of the dashboard. Cool, they were baptized on this day. You pretty much every church has some managing CRM system. So where are they now? It's been 5 years. What's with one click of a button, you can see how often they've attended, how often they've given, how often they've served. Like, what do you mean you can't measure? Yeah, you might be able to measure their heartbeat and spiritual growth as an individual, but you can measure their small group attendance. You can measure if they've ever stepped into leadership. Like, all of those things are not going to measure whether or not they've followed your system. It's going to measure whether or not they've been developed.
Like, yeah, I'd be curious to hear from the listeners, and maybe we'll make this a short too. How many people feel like their church database software is actually not that helpful? Because before coming to Elevation, I never felt like ours was that great, the software. And then now in Elevation, we use Salesforce, which is like a Fortune 500, like super big corporate, not Fortune 500. I just say that. I don't know what that means, but like a huge one. but it's almost so good that it's complicated that I don't know how to use it.
Yeah.
I just wonder how many people actually feel like they either don't know how to use it or it's not helpful.
Dude, I mean, honestly, I'll give shout out to Chris Ray, right? So homies in the back end of one called The Rock. I'm pretty sure it's from Life Church. We used it in Rockford
on my birthday this
Holy
year.
smokes.
Yeah.
Good for him. I mean, as long as I've known the dude, he only ate chicken nuggets, but I'm sure he's a grown adult now and he's crushing it. But that was like such a in-depth program for a CRM for management and client relational tool and management, all that stuff. But did I do a good enough job at getting to know it and utilizing it properly? Definitely not. Knowing what I know now about how to operate CRMs and how to create all of those things.
To be fair, at that church, Chris got to work like 8 hours a week and they made him work out of a janitor's closet. And now he works at Life Church building the freaking thing. Shout out, Chris. Legend.
Hey, man, the first church I worked for was also in a closet inside of a townhome, little video editing suite.
Well,
that's where all the legends are made.
I think, again, if we're new into the podcast, if you're wondering, man, is this podcast just negative? Is this podcast pointing out just problems? Is this podcast anti the church? The podcast is really the part where we like to ask a lot of tough questions. We like to ponder. We like to wonder. We like to help maybe go into the clouds, go into the depths of the sea. Everything else that we do, and even a lot of what we end up posting on socials and short form and our learning community, Youth Pastor Academy, all of it goes to providing solutions and working with churches. And we love the church. We love the church. We believe in the church. We're just also not afraid to have some of the tough questions, to ask some of the tough questions. And honestly, if you're a pastor, you're someone who, man, if you think we're being negative, help us figure it out. Talk to, I think that one of the worst, I would say that the last thing I'll say, and then you can sign us off. I think that one of the worst things in the church right now, and that is holding us back, is this idea that just because something's positive, it means that it's negative. Like just because something's not, it's a heavenly hotspot, we're moving forward. And just because someone asks a tough question doesn't mean they're anti the house. That might actually mean that they're pro the house. And when we look at biblical prophets, a lot of times the best answers came from the hardest questions. And so I think that's just what we want to ask. And all that we're doing is we're also self-reflecting. Before this episode, we were like, dude, neither of us have, in our over a decade of youth ministry, really ever done well with parents. We've never really done well with young adults. Like there's a lot of wins we have in other areas, but we're looking back too saying, man, we missed it. We in some ways, we are a part of the problem and we own that. But now we want to be a part of the solution.
Yes, no, 100%. And that's the goal, is not to be negative, but I'm a firm believer that if you don't help people answer the questions, they will go somewhere to find those answers. If you don't allow those tough conversations with even your own staff, your staff will leave because they can't talk about those things because they need to navigate the tensions that they are. So I always encourage people. I love conflict because conflict brings resolution. So life is not 100% positive and cherries all day, every day. It's just real and transparent. And the amount of things that I didn't know how to navigate as a younger youth pastor, oof, man, probably would blow my mind, and we do not have the time to go into them no matter how many episodes we do. But that's the goal, is one by one to dive into them and go, man, here's where we blew it. Here's where I still see a problem, but here's solutions that I can see now that I couldn't see back then.
Yeah.
And how do we help people avoid those pitfalls? Because why wouldn't we do that? Why wouldn't we? So yeah, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for being a part. Jump in and look for more, because there is always more to come.
Bye, guys.